think of at the end, like when we finish,
Oh.
just don't hesitate.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll try to keep it some little humorous things
Good,
too,
good.
and we will try to give you highlights and not get too far off track.
Yeah,
All right.
absolutely.
So
Vignettes are really good for this.
yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. We're here at Jerry Conley's law office in downtown Portland. It's August 15th, Jerry, so do you know that that's the Feast of the Assumption?
I'm aware of that, yes. And is it wrong for me to count going to church yesterday as satisfying my day of obligation?
I will count that for you. And so I'll try not to make too many assumptions in the interview that we're doing today. But
Fair
in
enough.
advance, thank you for the interview.
Thank you for the chance to participate in your project. I think it's really important for the Irish Heritage Center. I think it's important for the Irish community, those of us who are Irish, and I appreciate all the work you do trying to make our heritage known to people.
Well, I think we make a good combination. Conley the short way, Conley the long way. East End meets West End, so
Indeed.
détente. Thank you, Jerry.
You bet, Mike.
Oh.
It would have made it more difficult.
Yeah,
so,
as you said, and when you said that, I understood immediately.
yeah, yeah.
Kim, all set?
Whenever you're ready.
Okay, and are you going to need to stop at any times, or?
If we go over 40 minutes in one take, then I'll need to switch to a different.
And I think we will with this list. Is that
Sure.
okay for you?
I'm fine if you're fine.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's
Just
fine. I'll
tap me on the
I'll let you
shoulders.
know when we're
Okay.
getting close.
Okay. Okay, the Feast of the Assumption, August 15th, interview with Jerry Conley Jr. And Jerry, I wonder if you could start off telling us a little bit about growing up, maybe the West End, Taylor Street. What was it like growing up in a family of 13?
Well, as you know, Michael, and because I've sat with you and interviewing my father, who totally ran the show of our house from the outside because he was such a political giant in Portland terms. But the real person who ran the house, of course, was my mother. We had 13 children, which wouldn't be bad enough except for the fact 10 of them were boys. And so, you know, my mother was pregnant about half of her life on the planet. She died at 62. But what I recall the most is we lived on Taylor Street, and my mother never had a driver's license because my father tried to teach her how to drive, but you can imagine how that went. He was a little tough. So she would take us downtown every day, 4 or 5 of us, kind of all latched to this carriage, and that's back when you had Grant's and Woolworths and all of these stores, and we'd go in and out of these stores crying and screaming, and my father always said the reason Portland's downtown died was because of us. So, you know, we were kind of little hellions. But, you know, what I remember about her, you know, she lost her 13th child, and that, you know, there could just never be enough children. And she really never quite recovered from that. She was so sad for a long time. And the other thing I remember was in '68, you know, I was like 15, and about the night Bobby Kennedy got shot. We stayed up, for me and her. I just remember sitting around the TV set, and she was so upset about that, probably because of the number of children Bobby Kennedy had, and she just very, very saddened by that. But, you know, being a mother, I just remember my father, 2 vignettes. He always went to get her, every one of the children, but for me, I was born in Chicago, every one of the children were born at the Mercy Hospital. And he would go there when she was being discharged, and they'd put her in the little wheelchair with the little rat baby to come back out, and he'd look around at the staff at the desk and say, "See you again next year, making our reservations now." And one other little story, he was there when my brother Danny was born, like number 7. And he's in the waiting room. And of course, those days you smoked and cigars. And the doctors come down at 2 in the morning and say to him, "Jerry, Ann's all right, you got a baby boy," and looks at this other fellow who my dad did not know and says, "You know, Mr. Jones, your first child's healthy. We'll bring you boys up in a few minutes." You know, those days they stayed downstairs. So a couple minutes go by, and this guy looks at my father and says, "Oh, you know, Mr. Conley, I don't know how to ask you this, but this is your 7th. You know, when will, you know, my wife and I be able to get together again? You know?" And my father looks at him and says, well, it all depends, Sam, whether or not you have a private room. And, you know, we always thought that that was a very, very funny story, so.
Tell me just a little bit more about your mom, her family name, and where did she
Yeah, this is an interesting thing too. Her name was Duff, and they're from the north, but they were Catholics. And so she grew up down in Newbury Street, which was quite Italian, of course, and a lot of Jewish folks too, but a little Irish enclave. But my father, who was chasing her around, you know, she was from a smaller family. But they saw the likes of him because back in those days he was, let's just say, drinking in his early 20s. And they shipped her out to Chicago trying to get him away from her. And he chased, as he likes to say, her laundry cart out there. And eventually they got married in Chicago and came back here and started this tribe.
Did any of your siblings ever kid you about being born outside of Maine?
Oh, it's an ongoing, forever joke, how I can never be a Mainer, the same way most folks who, you know, born one day in one state, you come here, you're never going to be part of Maine.
There was a longshoreman whose nickname was Chicago. He was a coin, and there were so many coins working that they designated him, because he lived in Chicago for a couple of years. He was Chicago Coin. And there was another fellow named, well, there were so many Michaels, that one of them was Mickey from Lynn, Mickey from Newton Upper Falls, and so that was the way they designated people.
I was fortunate not to be part of the Longshore family working down there, because I'm sure I would have been designated as an out-of-towner, out-of-stater.
You raised an interesting point there. You said your mom was from the her family was from the north. Were you ever able to trace the townland that either your dad or your mom's people came from in Ireland?
You know, we spent, and my father more so than anyone was somewhat obsessed with this. My mother never really cared about finding out where she came from. She really sort of considered herself Irish American, emphasis on American. But they were very poor from the north. We've never gone back to look for her roots. My father spent an awful lot of time in Galway, specifically Spittle, really right in the parishes and with the parish priests in the cemetery, looking for his relatives. And about all we ever found was Connolly was a town, a little village next door to Spittle, which had blown down in a hurricane. And the entire town was wiped out, and we're thinking that's probably what happened. All the Conleys, as you probably know, are from the east, you know, and I think we were blacksmiths by trade and training, and then the British drove them to the west, and you know, the rest of it was famine. So
we were lucky to be driven to the west, probably.
Yeah, right.
As beautiful as that is today.
Yeah, I ran into a guy from Wexford, and he told me Wexford is kind of the heart of Conley country before they were driven away.
Irish language. Any Irish language in your family past, grandparents or anything like that that you're aware of?
My father's people, he would have been third generation. They never really spoke the language. Now, there were families around who did, but no. And of course, the folks from the north, verboten. The English language had been dominant for a long time.
Right. Last thing about the family, the gender composition of your family.
Yeah, that we always claimed that our sisters were spoiled rotten, of course, but you know, there was one bathroom, and we were on a flat, and you know, and as I said at the Irish Heritage Center event the last time we were there, and not to be taken the wrong way, but growing up, we were all the boys. You know, 2 or 3 of us to a bed was not strange, and in fact, as I like to say, the only time any of us ever slept alone was, you know, after we got married.
Okay, let's focus a little bit more now on your dad. And one of the, anybody that knows your dad knows how important his participation in Alcoholics Anonymous has been over the years, and what he has done for hundreds and hundreds of people in Portland. So could you tell us a little bit about the fact that he's now celebrating his 60th year of sobriety, and a little bit about the role that that has played in his life and your family's life?
Yeah, it's been a huge thing in our family. I mean, you know, he was never a preacher to us. We didn't live under these incredible rules. But as we like to say, you know, half of the 12 children are in AA and the other half ought to be. But you know, with him, the 60 years, we went to his 60th anniversary at the Woodfords Church, which was a pretty big deal. It was like 300 people at the meeting. And he's a god in that community, as you might imagine. And I still remember he's thanking everybody who's there, and he points to our table and he says, "My family is sitting up back." He says, "You'll note there are 8 of my children at the table, which I'm so glad you could all come here, and I want you all out there to know the other 4 are outside protesting." So we always got a big boot out of that, you know. And he, you know, his biggest accomplishment, if you ask him what he ever did in the legislature, and he would say it was the decriminalization of public intoxication, because that really, really troubled him, that people would be arrested and put in jail for just being intoxicated. One, of course, it was a disease. So it's always been a huge part of his life.
Some people gain sobriety and see it as an individual accomplishment that they've done. And in the case of your father, he stayed active with it, helping other people. Why do you think he was that way?
I think a lot of it was growing up in a very Catholic household with this, you know, sort of a Jesuit mantra, which he always, that was the one thing he preached to us, which was, you know, to be a person for others, to try to do something to help others. That's your obligation. That was the reason the Kennedy family was such a model for so many Irish, but particularly for us. And you know, when he got involved in the 1960s in politics, politics really were a replacement for alcoholism. His whole campaign staff were all AA people, and they were driving around the county in these cars and with these Conley for sheriff boxes on the top of them. And people were like amazed that somebody would get out there and have this type of devotion. But that's what they did. And he was in a very crowded primary field, 1964, 4 of them. He was the youngest by far, and the other 3 were cigar-smoking deputies, and his campaign slogan was, "The day of the cigar-smoking sheriffs, those days are over." And he won that primary. But it was all based on his AA friends out there, because he'd traveled everywhere to AA meetings and bringing that message of sobriety and mindfulness really to the entire county.
Now, after his successful run for sheriff, he went into the legislature, and one thing I noticed that you and he had in common was that you served 2 terms in the lower house. But while he was there, I understand that there were plenty of what we would today call characters. Could you tell us a little bit about some of those characters?
Yeah. So first, you know, he ran for sheriff twice, and he won the primary both times, but got beat in the general election by the Republican. They wanted him to run again in '64 for sheriff, but he didn't, and he ran for the legislature. And of course, that was the big Johnson landslide. And so there were characters, because back in those days, there was the big box. You know, you voted all Democrat or all Republican, and as I mentioned to you earlier, my mother never allowed us to vote for any Republicans, except for Edward I. Bernstein. That was the only one, and that's because it was a council race. But back in those days, you don't have these folks anymore. So you had a guy by the name of Bart Sullivan, and because people were picked in the primary down in alphabetical order, you went down the names, and there were 11 that would go from Portland. There were usually 25 people running. Bart could never win, so he went and tried to get the probate court to change his name to Sullivan Bartholomew, so that he would be up near the top. You know, he eventually did go to the legislature, but he was crazy. Then there was this guy, Alfie Smith. Now, Alfie was a cab driver in Portland. He was just a great guy. My father totally loved him. And in that landslide, he got elected to the Senate, which was unbelievable. And so Alfie's first thing was, because you got expenses driving back and forth for gas mileage. And Alfie drove his cab back and forth and tried to submit a bill for cab rides for himself back and forth to Augusta. My father always tells a story about going to a conference with Alfie up in Orono. And on the way back, it was a big snowstorm, and he and Alfie got into an argument coming down the turnpike, which they often did. And my father says to him, "I'm getting out of the cab." And so in the middle of this snowstorm on the turnpike, my father just gets out of the cab. And so Alfie is all steamed up, so he takes off. And luckily for my father, some truck driver came by and he got right in and got home. But the next day, Alfie calls my house and my mother answers the phone. And my mother would never lie, but my father just said, "You have got to cover me on this." And so she says to Alfie, "Geez, Alfie, I thought he was with you. He's not home yet." And so Alfie continues to call that day, night, the next day. "Isn't he at the conference with you, Alfie? He's not home yet." And so Alfie's out of his mind because he thinks that he's died in this big snowstorm. And so finally, my father's walking down Congress Street by the Splendor, and Alfie, of course, has the cab out there. And there he is. And Alfie says, "Why the heck?" You know, yeah. So, but they patched things up. But Alfie was a total character, as you can tell.
What about other characters like Mr. Democrat?
Oh, yeah. You know, Louis Jalbert was there. And Louis, of course, Louis's got his own case in the court reporters for, fraud and other things. I mean, my father would tell you that there was no graft or corruption, and even in the time I was up there, that I ever saw in the Maine legislature. But if there was an exception, some would say it might have been Louis. He ran the entire show from Lewiston, and he was quite the character.
Now, there's other stories that come out of the legislature. The Moose Bill.
Yeah. My father, you know, he had a lot of fun when he was up there because he just had this incredible sense of humor, you know. And of course, with all the time he was there, he opposed opening a hunt for moose, which had been almost sort of like, trying to get car dealerships open on Sundays. You know, there were some of these bills that were put in over and over again. And the moose had long been a protected animal, but of course their numbers grew, and the biologists at the state said, "Look, we got to start," as my father loved the line, "harvesting." When you're putting a bullet in their head, harvesting the moose. So in any case, he became the great defender of the moose, which of course is on the state seal. And he always had the line, because he was able to keep it from becoming law a couple of times till finally the biologists won. But his line was, "Yes, the Maine moose, the only game animal known to man you can have your picture taken with before you shoot it." And that line was always one that went national, you know. In fact, when Brennan was running for governor, he and Flanagan were traveling around up north. He was the attorney general, and Flanagan ran over a moose. And so you can imagine my father, he had a heyday with that. And that made national news, you know. Brennan's out there running around, campaigning for governor, and he's killing moose, the sacred animal of Maine. And Joe was so furious with him, because Brennan couldn't generate a headline going down to town at that time. And my father sort of steals the show with that one, yeah.
That story reminds me of the Wicked Good Band, who one of their most famous lines is, "The state of Maine license is the only license with a dead animal on it." But the lobster, of course, is red.
Yes.
On the Maine license. Arthur Stolfen, the airplane story?
Yeah, that's a funny little story too, One rule in Augusta, when you're a lobbyist or you have any sort of a bill that you're interested in, you should never go into the chamber when they're debating it in the Senate. And that's the whole thing. The thing about the House, you mentioned 2 terms in the House for my father and I. You quickly figure out that the House it's a herd. There are about 3 or 4 shepherds down there that make things happen. But in the Senate's where things really happen. That's where bills are killed or laws are made, And you can go in and sit in the back of the chamber when they're debating a bill. You can't do that in the House. You're up in the gallery. Anyway, Arthur Stolfen was the Commissioner of Public Safety. And my father, just never really a big fan of police in general, He just, because he'd been, when he was drinking, he'd been clobbered over the head so many times, it was just something, he never really going to get out of his system. And they were debating a bill about Arthur wanted another plane to put out over the roadways to get speeders. So he had that in his budget that had just been heard downstairs. Now Arthur's in there on another bill affecting his police, the state police of whom he was in charge, and my father sees him in there and immediately stands up and says, "I note that the Commissioner of Public Safety is here, and we've just heard, besides this bill, we were downstairs listening to his testimony, he wants another plane to patrol Maine's highways to get unsuspecting speeders down below. Well, I say, why give him one? Let's give him 5, and they can fly in formation so he can get as many speeders as he wants. And Arthur is just sort of slinking out of the chamber, but it brought the House down, or the Senate down, as we would say.
Talking about driving up the highway and monitoring that, what about going up 295 before it was officially over?
Yeah, you have a good memory, Michael. Yes, that was another one of his, big things. A lot of press coverage on that. When they created the spur from Brunswick to Gardner, which allowed you to get off of the turnpike in Portland and go all the way to Gardner without having to pay a toll. The Turnpike Authority didn't really want that piece of road opened until it absolutely had to be opened, particularly in the summertime when they were getting all these tolls from out-of-staters who had to use the turnpike to get to Augusta. And so they were very nervous about it opening. Well, my father, he knew something wasn't right. They kept asking, why isn't it opened? And he and Senator Peter Danton, God rest his soul, he and Peter were very, very good friends. And they would go on the road at night, which had these big barricades in front of it and said closed, okay? And so they would go around it and go out, and they claimed to be out there inspecting the road. Well, they would go all the way down to Brunswick. There was no problem. The road was quite ready to be open. And they got caught out there by a state trooper, as did Larry Conley got caught too, because he said, Larry, go check it out. It's really, well, needless to say, that became a big story. And so they immediately said, this road should be open. The public's getting gypped. Why not open the road? And had a big press conference on it. And Longley was mad at them. Of course, he didn't want his commissioner embarrassed. But Governor Longley got on that road with his own trooper, and he found out too that it was open, and sure enough, soon enough the road was open. So they were activists in their own right.
Well, Jerry, you made a really good segue into the next thing that I'd like to talk with you about. A lot of people who remember Portland, especially the West End, in the 60s and 70s, would remember the People's Building and the Model Cities time. So could you share for us some of your memories or your dad's memories of people such as Larry Conley and Jim Oliver and the People's Building?
Yes, or as we discussed, my father always called it the People's Temple because of Jim Oliver was, really people drank the Kool-Aid and became his disciples, So, and of course Larry was one of them. Another guy who was in the legislature with my father, senator from up the coast, Bruce, whose last name escapes me now. But Bruce used to write all of the grants for the People's Building, and I always said to Bruce Reeves was his name, who was a state senator. He and Larry and Jim were very tight, and they ran the whole program up there. But I always said to Bruce, once you pass away, the epitaph on your tombstone is going to be, my grant has finally run out. They just did tremendous things for the city. My father was on the city council. He was the mayor with 12 kids. They had pictures went across the country of our family. But really, Larry and Jim would go to him for everything to get monies for that building, for programs for kids, whether it was, learning how to build things, finishing school, or just housing for the neighborhood. He was their go-to guy, and to this day, Learning Works is really the successor from the projects that were being run by Larry, who was just such a tremendous human being, and Jim, who's moved to D.C. That was my father's favorite thing to do on the council, was to help them. The Model Cities money, too, was there.
Off the topic of your dad just for a second, though, your own memories of Larry Conley, perhaps.
Larry and I were very close. Larry and I rode to Augusta every day for the 2 years I was there with him. He passed away at the end of my first term in the House. But I remember doing Larry's taxes, and now his son Jesse, who's such a great guy. Jesse went to Bates. His 2 sisters went to Villanova. Nancy, his wife, still alive. Just such a wonderful family. I think Jesse was 12 at the time. But I remember doing Larry's taxes that first year I was in the legislature with him. He made, in 1986, $13,000. Now think about that. And he had a family with a wife who didn't work. who he raised, and look at the great things these kids went on to. I mean, Larry, you know, was in the seminary at first. He never stopped being a priest. I would sit at his kitchen table at night when we'd get home from the legislature, and people would just come in throughout the night, neighbors, people without, you know, any food stamps, people who lost their housing. He really was. There'll never be another person like him, in my opinion.
One little item that I heard about was that, of course, he died prematurely and was mourned at St. Dominic's.
Oh, yes.
And somebody said of the many miracles that he created during his lifetime, filling St. Dominic's was one of the last ones that he did.
I was at that funeral, and I still wished that I could have had a chance to speak at the funeral. Jim Oliver gave the eulogy, and he did a wonderful job, but Larry was a person everyone kind of aspired to be, the consummate giver. But far and wide, the Republicans were all there, Democrats were all there. Back in those days, people kind of got along pretty well, but that place was absolutely packed. Yeah, he was a special person.
Someone told me that virtually on his deathbed, he got the news that the waterfront referendum had passed, and that was something that nobody gave them any chance of winning, and yet it has probably preserved the working waterfront of Portland.
No question, and I'll just give you an interesting insight on that. I was the only legislator at the time who opposed the referendum, and I opposed it because I felt you can't zone by referendum. This is something that should be done by professionals. But in the end, their cause was just, and they were right. But you know, Larry, and here's the difference. Larry and I would debate this every day, going up and forth, back and forth. But he actually listened. He listened to my point of view. And though I never persuaded him and he never persuaded me, they were still really positive conversations. And you could actually talk about something without yelling at each other. And one of the many reasons I had such great respect for him. You know, he really was, I'll say it again, a special person.
As you're describing that, I'm thinking about the poor relations between Democrats and Republicans today, and I was thinking of the word civil war, and it's an oxymoron a bit, isn't it? But you're describing a relationship, a debate with Larry that really was civil.
Yes, I really feel like it was. You know, and things were a little bit different back then anyway. I think there were more civil discussions between the parties and between opposing views, and why things have become so ginned up now, where violence seems to be more and more the answer to everything, and screaming at each other seems to be the way. I'm not exactly sure, but back then, at least from my perspective, you know, Larry in particular was a listener. He was way out on the left, but people loved him in the legislature. He was the go-to guy for all human service programs, all programs involving you know, AFDC, aid for dependent children with single moms, and he was their savior.
Jerry, I'd like to move on to another Irish political icon in the Democratic Party, and the relationship between your dad and Governor Joe Brennan.
Yeah, they went into the legislature together in 1964 in the House. Matter of fact, Joe Brennan, my father, and John Martin, all of whom are still alive, and John is still in the legislature. But three icons of the Democratic Party from that era. And Joe and my father were close throughout. You know, it's very, very interesting how, you know, my father never had the education because of the drinking, you know, and you know, Joe saw in him someone who had some tools, some smarts, some intellect. And my father obviously saw Joe as a person who had great potential. And through some fortune, because as we talked earlier, sometimes failure can lead to great things. And so in 1974, actually started in 1970, my father was going to be the minority leader, but Joe ran for the Senate. He got out of the DA's office because he wanted to run for governor eventually. And my father immediately said to him, "You're going to become the minority leader here." And so Joe became the minority leader in 1970, 72. And then in 74, he ran against George Mitchell for the Democratic gubernatorial nomination. And what happened there? Well, Mitchell was the party favorite. He was the guy Muskie wanted, the guy Curtis wanted. And Joe was the outsider. Joe had Irishmen. My father in Cumberland County, Davy Redmond in York County, Ed Kelleher in Penobscot County. It was kind of an Irish mafia type of thing. But Joe ran an extremely credible campaign on very little money, and they went everywhere. He came up short. It was not unexpected, but he took the loss very, very badly. Still, everyone thought George would become governor, and then he gets the surprise of his life and loses to Jim Longley. Well, before George could recover from that loss, he wanted to become Attorney General when he got over it a few days later. But my father and Senator Peter Danton had already called all the Democrats, and Joe Brennan had the Attorney General's job sewed up. So where did that go to? Jim Longley was a very popular governor in spite of his difficulties with my father and other Democrats in the legislature, but he kept his word. He was only going to run one term. And during that time, Joe was the Attorney General. The Indian Lands Claim suit became a major issue. Joe was against the Indians, which was very popular, much to the dislike of Larry Conley and other people who wanted to see the Indians treated fairly. But Joe ended up becoming governor because of that issue, because of being the Attorney General, and because of that loss to George Mitchell. So there you go. It's that friendship became stronger and stronger, and my father was never at home. He was running around the state with Joe, and we were running phones for Joe, all the kids, and everybody else who was involved in politics back then for Joe Brennan. And he successfully became governor of the state of Maine in 1978.
Another example of what you referred to, a failure leading to success, would be the failure of George Mitchell in that gubernatorial election, and then after a short time as a federal judge, being surprisingly appointed, surprising to most people, I think, for the position that Senator Muskie had vacated. Could you talk a little bit about this and bring your dad into that story?
Yeah, and that's a great story, one for the ages. My father and Joe, the 8 years that Joe was governor, I mean, it was a great thing for my father and their friendship became stronger. My father was running all kinds of bills for Joe in the Senate. They had control of the Senate by the end of it all. But those 8 years, we as kids kind of went to Celtics games, Red Sox games, Maine Day, Bruins, Patriots. Joe was very inclusive, and they became very, very close. Now, tying that into George, and George Mitchell, what can we, the Irish, say about him? He brought peace to our land, even you talked, I ran into an Irishman last night. He's all for Clinton because Clinton put George Mitchell in Ireland and brought peace to the land. They're just never going to support anybody else, all right? But George, in some circles, felt like, hey, now look, this guy, first of all, he became U.S. Attorney. That's a political appointment. Next, he's been appointed to a federal judgeship. People want that. That's a very, very big gift or appointment for your political allegiance. I mean, in the end, it's not who's qualified, he's qualified. But, how do people become judges? Well, you either know the governor or the president, or you have a friend who knows the governor or the president.
And a lifetime appointment at that.
Right. Those are the qualifications. It's knowing someone who knows them. In the end, because there's all kinds of qualified people. George Mitchell, extremely qualified. But then, from those two appointments, and Joe appoints him to the U.S. Senate. Now, my take on that, and now in hindsight, the greatest appointment of all time ever, and George Mitchell, one of the greatest politicians ever to come out of Maine. But the dynamics going on behind the scenes for that appointment were incredible. Bill Hathaway, who just lost to Bill Cohen. Joe, I should be appointed. I've been there. I know the job. I've already served in that position. Forgetting the fact he lost by 200,000 votes to Bill Cohen. There's a lot of people who don't care for you, Bill. Governor Curtis, who, again, very, very revered. I mean, but for Governor Curtis, we wouldn't have an income tax, which many people don't like, but this state and the fact we have a university system and all the services that we have here is because of that income tax, which passed by one vote, and Ken Curtis won re-election by 400 votes. People were very angry about that. He's a great leader, made Maine what it is, and another one of the great governors of Maine. Wanted that job. Harold Pacious wanted the job. Severin Beliveau wanted the job. And all these people are putting all kinds of pressure on Joe. Well, lo and behold, his best friend, Jerry Conley, Joe brings him over. He wants to talk with him. Well, you know, who do you think I should go with? And my father says to him, Joe, I think you should put me in that job. You imagine that, putting that pressure on your friend. I think you should put me in the job. And Joe says, you said in the paper yesterday you had no interest in the job. You know, i.e., that's why I brought you over here to help me figure this out. And my father's response was, that's what I told them to cover you, but I'm the best person for the job. It's never fashion to be loyal to those who have been loyal to you. So he really put Joe on the spot, okay? And, you know, this is one of the many reasons why I have such tremendous respect for Joe Brennan. As much as I love my father, you know, he made a very tough decision, which all Joe's decisions were. He, too, one of the greatest governors this state has ever had, because he took the time to deliberate, be considerate about his decision, and George Mitchell turned out to be the greatest appointment.
And your dad came around to understand that?
Absolutely. You know, that's the one thing about friends, you know. You can be as mad as hell at someone, and I'm never talking to you again, but because of the depth of the love and the friendship, survives everything. Yeah.
Now, recently, George Mitchell published his latest book, The Negotiator. And in that book, the first section I turned to, because I was interested in that appointment, he revealed that Senator Muskie was not promoting Mitchell, rather he was promoting Ken Curtis, to the surprise of many people. I wonder how that affects your thinking about this.
Yeah, that, again, is a dynamic of which I became aware after the fact. It's obviously the senators put it out there. In the end, you know, Brennan was always an outsider with Muskie and Curtis, all right, and Mitchell. Mitchell was their pretty boy he was their guy. But Joe was always on the outside with those guys. You know, he supported McCarthy, you know, over Humphrey. I mean, you can imagine how that went over. So there was no love lost politically. Joe probably wouldn't talk about it, but I don't mind, you know, between those guys. So their recommendation, though Joe would listen to it, in the end was not going to carry the day. No, it's going to be what Joe Brennan thought was best for the people of Maine. And George Mitchell turned out to be that person.
Thanks for that, Jerry. I think we're about ready to wind up, but your dad is now approaching the silver years of his life, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about his reflections on this as he approaches his 86th year.
Yeah, he's had a great run, and we're you know, happy he's still with us. As he likes to say, I'm not 68, I'm 86. But you know, he went on after the state senate to be on the Unemployment Insurance Commission, to be on the Maine Turnpike Authority, was elected to the probate court, and there are lots of funny stories for each and every one of those little chapters in his life. But a life well lived, you know, really well lived. We are so fortunate to have had him for so long. He would have died an early death if he'd stayed on the bottle with 2 kids instead of 13. So.
I can't imagine what an honor it is for you to be a junior to such a senior.
It has. I've often said on that Turnpike building, I'm going to go out there and chip off the senior so it'll be in my name, since they named it after him out there. But yeah, it's just been great. He gave us all the opportunity to go out and become contributing members in our own right, and for that we'll always appreciate everything he's done for us.
Thank you, Jerry, for sharing all these memories of your dad.
Appreciate it, Michael. Great to do it.